Hello, I'm Morris Long, and this is a special bonus mini-episode of the Video Games Are Bad For You podcast. With the release of Sekiro looking imminent, I figured it'd be fun to go back and take a look at one of my personal favorite From Software games. And so today we're going to find 5 things I love and 5 things I hate about Bloodborne. To get us started here, let's take a look at something I love, and that would have to be the Hunter's Dream. Now, I know, the load times are not preferable, but in my opinion, the Hunter's Dream is the best level up hub in any of From Software's games. I actually think that by separating the Hunter's Dream from the base world, they were able to give it so much more personality than, for instance, Majula or even Firelink Shrine. On top of that, the doll is quite possibly the best NPC in any From Software game. It's at the very least in my top 5. And I love how many secrets they were able to hide in this hub. Once again, the fact that the Hunter's Dream has been separated from Bloodborne's base world means that they can do a lot more with it. All of that is a positive, and it's worth a little bit of extra load time. Now let's do something I hate. The Nightmare Frontier. Now this is unfortunate because the introduction of the Nightmare Frontier is pretty cool. I love walking into a large dark doorway only to pop out in this sort of mysterious daylight world in contrast with Bloodborne's base game. Unfortunately though, the Nightmare Frontier feels like one of the mini areas of Bloodborne that is somewhat unfinished. I can't tell if it has stolen enemy assets from Marigo's Loft, or if Marigo's Loft has stolen enemy assets from it. Either way, the Nightmare Frontier doesn't have a lot new to offer. There's a lot of rehashed enemies. Even the boss fight of the area involves a enemy, the Amygdala, that you've seen all over Central Yharnam by this point. To make matters worse, there's not even a lot of reward in going through the Nightmare Frontier, and as a result, it sort of feels like a maze with little purpose. This just doesn't feel like a finished area. On the other hand, something that feels quite finished, something I love, is Bloodborne's combat system. You can tell that From Software wanted to examine how they do combat in games and really explore new avenues of combat development. And it shows. Bloodborne has some of the best combat of the series, and on top of that, Dark Souls 3 sort of looked to just continue Bloodborne's style, rather than go back to the sort of old Souls-based combat. Bloodborne wants you to move fast, and it wants you to make quick decisions, but the combat system is fair and balanced enough to where even though you're making these really fast decisions, you very rarely actually feel like you're in a position where it's actually an unfair game. I would argue that this is one of the greatest combat systems in video game history. Regain, in particular, is a standout. It's a mechanic that you don't see in too many other video games, and the fact that the game actually would encourage you to take a serious risk while low on health sort of goes against the whole Souls formula in a way that feels really refreshing and new. I like that they decided to reward you for making something that would in previous games be perceived as a mistake, to sort of continue fighting even as you're taking damage. Speaking of mistakes, let's take a look at Castle Cainhurst, something I hate. Recently, some fans of Demon's Souls were able to data mine the game, and they were able to unlock a level that never made it into the final release. And this level looks an awful lot like Cainhurst Castle. This in no way surprises me. Cainhurst feels like a level from another video game. While, unlike in Nightmare Frontier, Cainhurst has its own enemy set, those enemies aren't particularly fun or engaging, and they do get pretty samey after time. On top of that, the sort of mood and ambiance of Cainhurst doesn't really match the rest of Bloodborne. Really, if you exclude how you get there, the rest of Cainhurst feels much more like something you'd see in Dark Souls 3. Making matters worse, Martel Ligarius is pretty inferior in comparison to some of the other bosses in Bloodborne, and once again, he doesn't really fit the world. He's like a weird wizard magic guy. Like, that isn't really something you see in the world of Bloodborne, which is supposed to be this Lovecraftian horror game. I don't understand why they chose this aesthetic for this game. And crowning off this low point of the game, when you beat Martel Ligarius, you wind up going into sort of this secondary secret castle and unlocking a Covenant system that was clearly not finished. The rewards of this Covenant are pretty lame, and the online components aren't very successful. I can imagine Cainhurst being a pretty cool level in a different video game, but it just doesn't really fit here, and it doesn't feel like it was finished. On the other hand, a level that feels pretty finished to me would be Marigo's Loft, something I absolutely love from Bloodborne. Marigo's Loft is my favorite level in the game. Now, you could take some points away from Marigo's Loft because, similar to Nightmare Frontier, you can detect some asset reuse going on in the game, but unlike Nightmare Frontier, the level itself is an absolute delight. It is filled with so many great ideas, from the Lovecraftian horrible thing that causes frenzy to proc on your character, to an elevator system that feels straight out of Super Metroid. Traversing this level for the first time is a legitimate pleasure, and it unlocks a sense of discovery that From Software is known for. And it has possibly my favorite touch in all of Bloodborne. This is the sort of lore that Miyazaki and From Software are really known for. It's a mystery that allows fans to fill in the blanks. Speaking of filling in the blanks, let's take a look at something I hate, which are chalice dungeons. Now, I can grant From Software that the chalice dungeon mechanic was really reaching, and it was a creative idea, and I like that they were trying to stretch themselves, but this just didn't really work for this video game. Enemies in From Software games have very primitive movesets. As a result, their placement winds up mattering much more than what they individually can do. The whole idea of a From Software game is that if you can find a way to take on these enemies one by one, you'll most likely come out on top. But it's when you get ganged up on that things become a problem. The problem with the chalice dungeons is that they randomize enemy placement. As a result, you oftentimes either fight one enemy at a time in sort of the most boring version of an action game ever, or you're ganged up on. In which case, all you're really doing is just getting screwed over by a bunch of spiders. You're not really advancing or enjoying the combat of this game. And don't get me wrong, I think that down the line, From Software could hypothetically construct a chalice dungeon system that would be really, really cool. It just doesn't seem to have made it into this game, and I think that the technology they would need to do it correctly doesn't exist yet. Taking a look at something I love, let's check out Ebrietas. Now, Ebrietas is not my favorite boss in all of Bloodborne. That still goes to Marigo's Wet Nurse. But one thing I love about Ebrietas is where she fits into the game. It's important to note how well hidden this boss is in the game. Not only do you have to beat an optional area, you also have to go through an illusory wall to even fight her in the first place. And that's incredible, because Ebrietas is one of the best looking enemies in the game. Her zone is so cool, and a beautiful piece of design. And on top of that, the fight is an absolute pleasure. The fact that From Software hid this boss behind a wall shows how much trust they put in fans of their games to sort of scrape every piece of content they can get. Many developers would want to put Ebrietas front and center, where she can really showcase the game's tone and the talent of the developers. But From Software instead gives her to us as a surprise. And that kind of surprise is what makes them so great at game design. Moving into something I hate, limited weapons. It was unfortunate how few good weapons exist in Bloodborne. On one level, there's just not very many weapons altogether. But having said that, many of the weapons that do exist aren't particularly interesting. For instance, the Saw Spear is sort of just a retread of the Saw Cleaver. Some cool ideas are wasted on weapons that just aren't particularly useful. A good example of this would be the Kirk Hammer, which is such a cool idea, but it's just not a very good weapon. This really damages Bloodborne's replayability. Now, the DLC did try to add a few new weapons to the game, and many of the DLC weapons are super cool, but it still felt like too little too late. I suspect From Software's mistake was putting equal emphasis on guns as they did on physical weapons, when in reality, the gun you use in Bloodborne really doesn't matter unless you're going for a super specific build. They probably should have halved the number of guns in the game to boost the number of melee weapons, but that's easier said than done. The final thing that I love, and the reason why I love Bloodborne so much, is its mood. This game has one of the most effective ambiances of any game ever made. The shadowy, Lovecraftian world of Bloodborne really reaches out through your TV screen. You can feel it in every nook and cranny of the game. There are so many parts of Bloodborne that are designed just to bolster its mood, as opposed to give you quote-unquote content. And that's to the game's benefit. For example, take a look at the lecture hall. Now, this isn't a very interesting area from a gameplay perspective. The enemies are pretty simple. You don't really do much here. There were a million ways to get you to the Nightmare Frontier that didn't involve a lecture hall being the middleman. But the addition of it is so cool because you actually feel like you're discovering this creepy new place in a mysterious world. And that word keeps coming back, right? Mysterious. Bloodborne is a game that actually feels like you are unraveling a mystery. And finally, something I hate, and this is a little gripe, is the balancing of the DLC. For the most part, Bloodborne has a pretty cool DLC. I really like 2 of the 3 zones in Old Hunters, and that's enough to make it worth your money. But it is really awkwardly balanced, and by balance what I mean is I don't quite understand where From Software intended the DLC to sit in the game. You can access it fairly early in the Cathedral Ward. On the other hand, the enemies sort of hit with the power of in-game enemies. On the other hand, the blood echoes and the collectibles you get from these areas don't really match that of an in-game build. Considering how many new items and armor sets the DLC brings to the game, it's a shame that you couldn't traverse it earlier, but you'd unfortunately need to be a pretty high-level Bloodborne player in order to really access the DLC with an early game build because of how hard many of these enemies hit, and considering how much of a flat wall Ludwig can be. Now don't get me wrong, I still love the Old Hunters DLC, I think it brings a lot to the table. I just wish it had been better folded into the greater game. You can actually find a better example of this in the DLC of Dark Souls 3, which catches a lot of flack, probably deservedly. But I will say Dark Souls 3's DLC fits very effectively into the broader game. It feels almost seamless. Well, that's all I got. That's 5 things I love and 5 things I hate about Bloodborne. If I had to give a final verdict on this game, I would absolutely say that I love it more than I hate it. I would consider it probably the best game of the previous generation, and the best game From Software has ever made. If you haven't played it, I would highly recommend doing so, and if you have played it, now's a great time to dust it off, because we've got a new From Software game on the horizon, one that I cannot wait to play and uncover and discuss on the podcast. Alright, thanks for listening. If you want to hear more of me, check out the Video Games Are Bad For You podcast. We're also gearing up for a lot of From Software coverage, so stay tuned. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on Twitter. Oh, and if you want to send us an email, and you should, look for us at videogamesbadforyou@gmail.com. That's videogamesbadforyou@gmail.com. And in case you haven't guessed, links are in the description below.